I used to think Christmas was just a date the calendar insisted on repeating, no matter how much it hurt some people. For years, December felt like a slow, cold hand closing around my chest, squeezing a little tighter every time the lights went up on Main Street and the carols started playing in the grocery store. I would nod at people, smile quando I had to, fix a broken chair here, a loose door there, do my jobs and go home, pretending it was just another day. But it was never just another day for me. Not after what happened on a Christmas Eve long ago. My name is Daniel, and this is not a story I ever planned to tell. It started with a little girl standing alone in the snow and a choice I made without thinking. I did what any decent person would say they would do, but the truth is, I didn't save just her that night. Something in me was dragged back from a place so dark I had started to believe I would never leave it. And the strangest part is that, for a moment, I even thought it was some kind of simple miracle. A lost child, a good deed, a quiet thank you. I had no idea that behind that little girl there was a millionaire mother, a powerful family name, and a buried truth tied to the worst night of my life. On Christmas Eve, when most people were setting the table, laughing in warm houses, arguing about silly things like overcooked turkey or wrong gifts, I was driving home on a silent road outside Winterbrook. The snow was falling in soft waves, the kind that makes everything look clean, almost holy. The radio was off. I did not want to hear one more song about joy and peace. Then I saw her, a tiny figure by the side of the road, pink coat, no hat, thin arms wrapped around herself, standing far too close to the place where the asphalt curves and drivers forget to slow down. I remember my heart jumping before my mind did. I hit the brakes. I opened the door. And in those first seconds, all I knew was that I could not let another child disappear into the kind of silence I knew too well. I thought that saving her would be the whole story. I thought I would call the police, find her parents, hand her back, maybe receive a forced smile or a handshake, and then go home to my empty living room and my old, tired Christmas lights. But that is not what happened. Instead, a woman in a perfect coat with eyes full of something she did not want to name walked into my house a few hours later. She said thank you. She said her name. And with that single word, with that surname I had tried to forget, the past came crashing through my walls like a storm. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. While you listen to this, tell me where you are, which city, which country, what kind of Christmas night you have outside your window right now. I will probably never see your street, but I like to imagine the lights, the cold or the heat, the noise or the quiet around you. Write it down, share it with me in the comments, so I know where this story is traveling. Because this isn't just about a single father, a little girl, and a rich mother. It's about what we do with pain when it refuses to leave. It's about the price of silence, the weight of guilt, and the strange way Christmas has of bringing ghosts back to the table. And if you stay with me, I will tell you how, on one Christmas Eve, saving a child on the side of the road forced me to face the night that had been killing me slowly for years. I have lived in Winterbrook my whole life, long enough to understand that the snow has moods of its own. Some nights it falls soft and harmless, like a quiet blanket trying to comfort the world. Other nights it feels heavier, sharper, almost like it's trying to remind us of something we'd rather forget. On that Christmas Eve, the snow had that strange weight. It carried memories in the air, memories I had spent years trying to bury under work, routine, and silence. As I walked out of the small workshop where I fixed broken chairs and repaired people's forgotten furniture, I felt the familiar sting of the cold against my face. It was the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and shakes loose everything you tried to hold together. I locked the door, tugged my coat tighter, and began the slow walk toward my truck parked at the end of the street. The town glowed with warm lights. Children ran with scarves flying behind them, families rushed carrying bags, and the soft hum of Christmas songs drifted out from cafes and little stores. Everyone looked like they were hurrying toward someone, toward warmth, toward celebration. I was just going home to a quiet house, a small tree I kept mostly out of obligation, and the echo of memories that always returned on that date whether I invited them or not. As I drove out of the town center, the lights faded and the road stretched into a dark ribbon swallowed by tall pines. The heater in my truck clicked a tired rhythm, the kind of sound you get used to when you don't have the money to fix every little thing. My hands tightened on the wheel as the snow thickened. I knew this road by heart. I knew every curve, every shadow, every place where the wind pushed harder. I also knew exactly where the asphalt still carried the mark of the worst night of my life, even though no one else could see it anymore. The world had moved on. I never really did. The headlights carved two pale tunnels in the darkness, and I tried to focus on the road, not on the memories creeping up behind me. I told myself to breathe, to just get home, to ignore the heaviness in my chest. But the thing about pain is that it doesn't need permission. It arrives when it wants to. I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost didn't see her. At first she looked like a shadow, tiny and still, barely separating from the falling snow. My heart stopped before the truck did. I slammed the brakes, and the tire slid slightly on the ice as the truck jerked sideways. The beam of light finally caught her. A little girl in a pink coat, thin, shivering, standing far too close to the curve where cars often passed without slowing. For a moment I could only stare, unable to understand why a child was there alone on a freezing night. Then something inside me, a memory, a fear, a voice, pushed me out of the truck before I even realized I'd opened the door. The cold punched me as soon as my boots hit the ground. I hurried toward her, afraid to scare her into stepping closer to the road, afraid to repeat a nightmare I'd lived once before. As I reached her, I dropped to my knees so we were at eye level. Her small face was red from the cold, her lips trembling, her eyes wide and lost like she wasn't sure what world she had stepped into. She didn't speak. She just stared at me like she was trying to decide if I was real or not. I asked if she was hurt. My voice came out softer than I expected, almost pleading. She shook her head slowly. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and her fingers were stiff and pale. I took off my gloves and gently placed them on her hands, covering them even though my own skin instantly burned with the cold. She blinked at me, confused, but didn't pull away. As I looked at her more closely, something twisted inside me. It wasn't just that she was a child alone in the snow. It was the way she stood, the way she breathed in short, frightened bursts, the way her small shoulders carried a weight too big for them. It reminded me painfully of someone I once held, someone who was taken from me on a night that looked frighteningly similar to this one. I lifted her into my arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She rested her head against my shoulder as if she had been waiting for someone to carry her. I walked back to the truck, opened the passenger door, and settled her inside. She looked around the interior like she wasn't sure she deserved to be there. Then, as I wrapped a blanket around her, she whispered one word so soft I barely heard it. Her name. Lily. I nodded gently, telling her she was safe now, even though I wasn't sure she believed me. Even though I wasn't sure I believed myself. As I pulled back onto the road, the snow seemed to fall harder, as if the night itself understood that something had shifted. I wanted to call someone, the police maybe, or some emergency line, but Lily kept glancing at me with wide, wet eyes, holding onto the blanket like it was her last lifeline. Every instinct inside me told me she needed warmth and calm before anything else. By the time we reached my house, a small wooden place tucked behind the pines, the storm was starting to grow. The porch light flickered weakly, like it was struggling against the wind. I carried her inside, past the half-lit Christmas tree and the faint smell of pine and old memories. She looked around with curiosity and fear mixed together, her small fingers clutching the edge of my coat. I placed her near the fire, lit the logs, and watched as the glow slowly filled the room. Lily stretched her hands toward the flame, watching it as if she had never seen something so warm. I knelt beside her, unsure what to say or do, feeling a strange pull inside me, a feeling I had buried for years, the instinct to protect, to care, to matter again for someone who needed it. And then it happened. A sudden, loud knock on the door. Sharp. Urgent. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission, it demands something. Lily froze. And in that instant, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, as if the night had only just started revealing what it truly held. The knock echoed through the house like something pulled out of a dream I wasn't ready to face. Lily stiffened near the fire, her eyes widening, her small shoulders curling inward as if she expected the world to strike her. I raised a hand gently, telling her without words that everything was fine, even though I had no idea if it was. The knock came again, firm but not angry, urgent but not violent. I stood, my joints cracking in the quiet room, and walked toward the door. My house was never silent on Christmas Eve, it always hummed with the ghosts of memories I tried to avoid. But now the silence felt alive, waiting. When I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the wind pushing snow across the small porch, drawing faint patterns like ghosts dancing in white streaks. I stepped outside, looked left and right, listened for footsteps or breathing or anything that might explain the knock, but all I heard was the storm beginning to swallow the night. After a few seconds, I closed the door, bolted it, and went back to Lily. She had not moved. She sat perfectly still by the fire, holding the blanket around herself like a fragile shield. I crouched beside her and asked softly if she knew who might be looking for her. She shook her head again, her gaze drifting toward the Christmas tree in the corner. It was small, decorated with old ornaments I'd kept for reasons I didn't fully understand anymore. One of them was a little wooden reindeer I had carved years ago with hands that were steadier and a heart that was lighter. Lily stood slowly and walked toward the tree, drawn to the faint glow of the colored lights. She reached out and touched one of the ornaments, a tiny bell with chipped paint that used to belong to my daughter. The sight of her holding it made something deep inside me tremble. She looked up at me as if asking permission, and I nodded. Her fingers brushed the bell gently, reverently, as though she sensed it meant something. I felt the weight of an old ache pressing against my ribs again. My daughter had loved that ornament, ringing it every Christmas Eve before running into my arms. That memory hit me so sharply that I had to look away for a second. I went to the kitchen to make something warm for Lily, keeping one ear tuned to her small movements in the living room. The house felt different with her there, not less lonely, exactly, but no longer hollow. The kettle hissed softly, the fire cracked, the wind howled outside, and Lily seemed to fill the spaces that had been empty for so long. When I came back with a mug of hot chocolate, she was sitting cross-legged on the rug, staring at the fire as if trying to understand what warmth really felt like. I handed her the mug carefully. She accepted it with both hands, lifting it as though it was a treasure she didn't think she deserved. She sipped slowly, her thin lips trembling against the heat. A small smile flickered on her face, fleeting but real. It startled me. I hadn't seen that expression on a child in my home for many years. I asked her where she lived, if she remembered any street names, any houses, any familiar places. She looked at me for a moment, her gaze drifting away almost immediately, as though searching for memories she could not reach. Then she murmured something soft, almost swallowed by the crackling fire. Something about a big house and people always talking in loud voices, about a mother who carried her phone more often than she carried her daughter, about drivers and nannies and strangers who felt more like shadows than people. There was a sadness in her words that did not belong to a 6-year-old girl. It was the sadness of someone who had learned early what loneliness tasted like. I felt anger spark inside me, anger at whoever had left her alone, anger at a world where a child could feel invisible in a house full of adults. But anger wasn't what she needed. So I stayed calm, listening to every broken little sentence she offered. I told her gently that she was safe now, and she stared at me with those wide, searching eyes, as if she wanted to believe me but didn't know how. After a while, her eyelids grew heavy. She tried to fight sleep, sitting up straighter, looking around as though she feared something bad would happen if she closed her eyes. I told her she could rest on the couch, and when I placed a pillow behind her head she whispered something barely audible. It sounded like thank you, though I wasn't sure. She curled up, pulling the blanket close to her chin, and slowly drifted off. Watching her sleep stirred something both warm and painful inside me. I sat in the armchair across from her, the fire painting soft shadows across the room. For a long moment, I simply listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing. It struck me how natural it felt having her there, how right it seemed to protect her. And that feeling terrified me. I had built my life around not allowing myself to feel this again. The last time I had let myself care so deeply, the world had torn everything away from me in one violent moment. I feared what would happen if I let myself care again. As the night deepened, I closed my eyes and leaned back, but I didn't sleep. My mind wandered to the old photographs stored in a dusty box under my bed, the ones I could never bring myself to throw away. I thought about my daughter's smile, about how she used to tug my sleeve when she wanted to help decorate the tree. I thought about how her laughter once filled this house like sunlight. And then I thought about the darkness that followed. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, pulling me back to the present. I stood and checked the locks again. Something about that earlier knock unsettled me, not because of the sound itself, but because of the way Lily reacted to it. Children don't usually freeze like that unless they've learned to fear something familiar. I returned to the living room, watching the sleeping child, her small chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of innocence and exhaustion. I knew I had to contact the authorities in the morning, but something in my gut told me this was not a simple case of a child wandering off. As I turned off the lamp, leaving only the glow of the fire and the Christmas lights, another knock at the door shattered the silence. This time, it was louder. Sharper. Closer to a demand than a request. Lily stirred on the couch. And I felt, for the first time that night, a cold fear crawl up my spine, not for myself, but for her. The second knock was different from the first. It carried weight, purpose, and something sharp beneath the surface, something that cut through the warmth of the fire and settled cold in my chest. Lily shifted on the couch, her small hands tightening around the blanket as if she sensed danger before seeing it. I moved slowly toward the door, each step heavier than the last. I felt as if the house itself had begun holding its breath. When I opened the door, the storm seemed to bow aside for the figure standing beneath my porch light. She looked out of place in the wildness of the winter night, like someone sculpted for a world of glass offices and glittering city towers rather than a lonely road in Winterbrook. Her coat was long and dark, the kind of fabric that didn't come from any store in our town. Her hair was tied back in a precise knot, but strands had broken loose, sticking to her cheeks from the dancing snow. What struck me most were her eyes, sharp, searching, trembling in a way that betrayed the calm exterior she tried to maintain. She said one word first, Lily, and her voice cracked on it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a heart cracks when it has been holding fear for too long. I stepped aside, and she moved past me with a desperate force, scanning the room until her gaze locked on the small figure curled up on the couch. She rushed to her daughter, dropping to her knees, her hands trembling as she brushed the girl's hair away from her face. I stood by the door, feeling strangely like an intruder in my own house. Lily woke slowly, blinking up at the woman with a mixture of recognition and uncertainty. The woman pulled her close, whispering things too soft for me to hear, her embrace tight enough to say what her words couldn't. After a moment, she looked toward me, and her expression shifted from relief to something more complicated, gratitude tangled with shock, and beneath it something darker, unspoken. She introduced herself quietly, though she didn't need to. The name Evelyn Hartman carried its own weight, a weight I recognized without knowing why. She thanked me in a tone that sounded rehearsed, like someone accustomed to giving polite gratitude at charity events or business dinners. But this wasn't polite gratitude. This was a mother realizing she nearly lost her child. She asked what happened, her voice steadying as she tried to assemble control again. I explained how I found Lily on the roadside, cold and alone. Evelyn's jaw tightened as she listened, but the emotion in her eyes flickered in ways she tried to hide. When I mentioned the knock on the door earlier, she looked sharply toward the entrance, almost as if she expected someone else to be standing there. I asked her how Lily ended up outside, but she avoided giving a clear answer. She simply said that they'd been visiting Winterbrook for business, staying at an estate on the hill outside town, and that Lily must have wandered off while the household was distracted. It didn't sound right. Not the words themselves, but the way she delivered them, calm on the surface, frayed underneath. She pulled out a card from her coat pocket, the edges crisp, the letters embossed in silver. Hartman Investments. Her name printed beneath it. A direct line. She extended it to me with a controlled expression that felt more like a transaction than a gesture of thanks. I hesitated, but Lily looked at me, and something in her eyes urged me to take it. When I slipped the card into my pocket, Evelyn's gaze softened in a way that looked almost involuntary. She rose slowly, lifting Lily in her arms. The girl rested her head on her mother's shoulder without saying a word. For a moment, Evelyn looked around my living room, the worn wooden floors, the small Christmas tree with its uneven lights, the fire humming in the background. Something in her expression shifted again, almost as if she recognized a kind of warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She whispered another thank you before stepping toward the door. But just before crossing the threshold, she paused. Her eyes drifted to the photographs hanging above my mantel. Simple frames. Not many. One of them held a picture of my wife and daughter, smiling, radiant, alive. Evelyn stared at that photo too long for it to mean nothing. I felt something twist inside me. A memory? A suspicion? A shadow I didn't yet understand. There was a flicker in her face, a moment where her composure almost cracked completely. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it, tightening her grip on Lily. She turned back to me, her voice quiet but weighted. If you ever need anything at all, call me. The words felt strange, like a hint of a promise wrapped in a warning. Then she stepped out into the swirling snow, disappearing into the night with her daughter in her arms. I watched her walk toward a sleek black car parked at the edge of the road. The driver jumped out to open the door, bowing slightly, but Evelyn didn't seem to notice him. She kept her eyes forward, shoulders tense, almost trembling. When the car drove away, the taillights glowing faintly through the snow, the silence that returned was heavier than before. I walked back inside, locking the door, wondering why her name echoed in my mind like a forgotten note from a song I once feared. I pulled the card from my pocket again. Held it in my hand. Stared at the silver letters. Hartman. A name I had heard before. A name whispered in police stations, in hospital hallways, in rumors after the accident. A name that lived in the margins of my darkest memory. Something inside me tightened. A connection I couldn't yet see clearly, but felt. Before I could think further, I turned toward the small camera on my mantel, the one I use sometimes to send videos to friends or anyone willing to listen to a lonely carpenter's thoughts. It felt natural, somehow, to reach for words in that moment. I told whoever might someday hear this story to write in the comments where they were watching from, what city, what country, what kind of Christmas they knew. I didn't know why I said it, only that part of me needed to feel less alone as the storm outside grew stronger. Then I turned off the light and sat in the dark, staring at the card, feeling the first spark of a terrible truth stirring beneath the surface. I woke before sunrise, pulled from sleep by a weight I could not place, as if the storm from the night before had settled inside my chest instead of fading outside my window. The house felt colder than usual, not because of the winter air slipping through the old wooden frame, but because something in me had shifted the moment Evelyn Hartmann stepped across my doorway. Her name lingered in my thoughts like an echo trapped in a narrow room, repeating itself in the quiet, refusing to soften. I moved through the house slowly, turning on the kettle, straightening the blanket Lily had used, staring at the faint outline of her small body still printed on the fabric. The memory of her curled near the fire lingered like a fragile warmth in a place that had forgotten how to hold it. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape washed in white silence. I stepped onto the porch, breathed the sharp morning air, and let the quiet pull me back to a time I had tried for years to bury. It began as a flicker in my mind, the road, the headlights, the sudden brightness of a moment that should have been ordinary but instead became the point where my life cracked open. In the weeks and months that followed the accident, I had studied every detail the investigators shared. I had listened to rumors whispered by neighbors, comments from hospital staff, fragments of conversations overheard in places where grief made me invisible. The name Hartmann had floated among those fragments like a ghost, never fully confirmed, always lingering, always close enough to sting. I went back inside and opened the small cabinet near my bedroom, the one I avoided more than anything else I owned. Inside sat a box I had not touched in years, covered in dust as if the world itself wanted me to forget its existence. My hands hesitated before lifting the lid. The photographs lay on top, the colors faded, the edges curled from time. My daughter's smile greeted me from the first picture, a reminder of summer days by the lake when her laughter rose effortlessly into the air. Beneath the photos rested the newspaper clippings, folded so many times the creases looked like scars. I spread them out carefully, letting the old headlines catch the weak morning light. Articles about the accident, about icy roads, about unfortunate timing. No mentions of names powerful enough to shift outcomes. Only whispers remained, the kind that lived between printed lines. As I read, the memory sharpened. There had been talk once of a luxury vehicle seen near the site. Talk of a driver who vanished before the authorities arrived. Talk of influence capable of dissolving evidence before it ever reached a file. None of it had been proven. All of it had lived in the corners of my thoughts, feeding a kind of silent rage that had eventually burned itself into exhaustion. I had convinced myself over the years that the truth no longer mattered. But now the name Hartmann sat in my pocket on a silver-embossed card, tangible and undeniable, as if the past had finally grown tired of being buried and reached out to pull me back into its grip. I closed the box slowly, feeling the weight of it travel through my arms and settle somewhere deep behind my ribs. The house felt smaller when I returned to the living room, as though the air had thickened with things unspoken. Mrs. Callahan's house stood quiet across the road, but I knew she would be awake by now, tending to her stove or feeding the birds she insisted needed her care even in the harshest winters. I walked across the snowy yard, each step sinking with a soft crunch that echoed strangely in the stillness. Her door was already unlocked, as it always was during daylight. The smell of warm oatmeal and old wood filled the space, wrapping itself around me with a familiarity I had relied on more times than I could admit. Her eyes studied me with that quiet knowing she carried, the kind that came from years of watching an entire town breathe in and out through seasons of joy and seasons of loss. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. I sat at her table, warming my hands on a mug she placed in front of me, and let the weight of my thoughts settle between us like a thick fog. When she finally spoke, her words skimmed the surface of memory rather than digging into it, yet somehow they reached the parts of me that had remained untouched for years. She recalled the winter of the accident, the rumors that had shaken the town, the conversations that died too quickly, the silence that followed in the wake of a tragedy no one could fully explain. She mentioned the wealthy family that had been in the area at the time, a family whose vehicles passed through town with dark-tinted windows and drivers who never looked anyone in the eye. She said she remembered hearing the name Hartmann whispered once in the market, spoken by a man who lowered his voice the moment he noticed her listening. Her recollections weren't confirmations, but they were enough to stir the old embers inside me, the ones I thought had turned to cold ash long ago. I thanked her before stepping back outside, though I wasn't sure the word held any meaning strong enough for what pressed against my chest. The sky had grown brighter, sunlight bouncing off the snow with a clarity that almost hurt to look at. I returned to my house, closed the door behind me, and felt the solitude wrap itself around my shoulders again. The card Evelyn had given me rested on the small table near the door. My eyes kept returning to it as if it were alive, as if it carried the missing piece of a puzzle I had never been meant to solve. I picked it up and turned it over, running my thumb across the embossed letters, feeling the weight of what they represented. The past reached toward me with cold fingers, urging me to make a choice. I walked to the phone, the receiver heavy in my hand. For a moment I simply stood there, listening to the faint hum of the line, contemplating the thin line between seeking truth and reopening wounds deep enough to bleed again. My heart pounded steadily, painfully, with a rhythm that reminded me I was still alive despite all the years I had spent feeling otherwise. I held the card at eye level, letting the name sink into me fully, completely, undeniably. The storm from the night before seemed to rise again inside me, not with snow or wind, but with the unmistakable sense that something was coming, something long overdue. And with a breath I could barely draw, I began pressing the numbers. The numbers on the card felt heavier than ink as I finished dialing and pressed the receiver to my ear. The call connected quickly, with the efficient rhythm of people who are paid to respond before the second ring. A calm voice on the other end greeted me by name before I had even fully introduced myself, as if my call had been expected, as if there was already a file somewhere with my details written in neat lines. I mentioned the house by the pines, the roadside, the child in the pink coat. The voice did not sound surprised. It simply offered a time and a place, a quiet cafe in town, a corner table reserved, an arrangement already made before I could fully decide if I wanted to accept. I realized, as I agreed, that I had stepped into something larger than a simple thank you. The cafe sat on a side street off Main, a place I rarely visited anymore. It smelled of roasted coffee and cinnamon and carried the soft murmur of people hiding from the cold. I arrived early, needing those extra minutes to steady the tremor in my hands. The snow outside clung to the glass, blurring the outlines of passing cars and pedestrians into pale smudges. Inside, warm yellow light pooled on polished wooden tables, and the small Christmas decorations on the counter tried to convince everyone that peace on earth was possible if they just bought another pastry and stayed long enough. When she walked in, the room seemed to rearrange itself around her presence. Evelyn moved with a controlled urgency, her coat perfectly in place, but her eyes exposed the storm she carried. She spotted me in the corner and joined me without hesitation, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, stepping into conversations with outcomes already calculated. Yet nothing about her posture suggested confidence. She sat with her shoulders slightly tense, hands clasped together on the table, knuckles pale against the dark wood. For a moment, we were two strangers separated by more than a tabletop. She looked at me with a kind of cautious recognition, as if my face belonged to a story she had read but never expected to see again. I studied her features, searching for some trace that might connect her to the broken fragments of my past, but what I found instead was something else: tiredness, tightly held guilt, and a determination that seemed almost desperate. She began to talk, not in rushed bursts, but in slow, measured sentences that carried more weight than their simple structure suggested. She described the trip to Winterbrook, the family property on the hill, the way business had pulled her away from her daughter even during the holidays. She admitted that Lily had been watched, but not truly seen, surrounded by adults obeying schedules and instructions, not by people who understood the quiet ache in a child's heart. Her words painted the life of a girl living inside a mansion that echoed with emptiness, and each detail made the memory of Lily's small figure on the side of the road feel even more wrong. The conversation shifted when I mentioned the accident from years before, the one that had carved a scar into my life that never fully healed. I watched the color drain slowly from Evelyn's face. Her fingers tightened around the porcelain cup in front of her, and her gaze dropped to the table as if the wood itself might offer her a way to escape what needed to be said. She did not flee. She did not deny. Instead, the careful mask she wore began to fracture. She told me that many Christmases ago, long before she became the woman she was now, she had been in a car driving through Winterbrook on an icy night. She described the vehicle, black and powerful, moving like it owned the road. She was younger then, sitting in the back, not in control of the wheel or the decisions. The driver had been drinking, just enough to blur the edges of caution without fully sinking into obvious fault. The family had been in a hurry, always in a hurry, trying to reach a private gathering where important people waited with important expectations. As she spoke, the pieces began to slide into place, forming a picture I had never wanted to see. She recalled the curve on the road, the sudden flash of another car, the screech of tires, the helpless sense of time stretching into something cruel. She remembered a collision, a jolt, a silence that felt like the end of the world. She remembered her own fear, pressed into the leather seat of a luxury car that seemed to float above consequence. She remembered voices afterward, low and controlled, voices of men making phone calls, rearranging reality with influence and money. She remembered being told to forget what she had seen, to trust that everything would be handled, to accept that the story would not include her name. I sat there listening, feeling the old wound in my chest tear open anew. There were no raised voices between us, no accusations shouted across the table, only the heavy truth sliding into the space like a third presence. She said that the accident had never left her, that every Christmas carried the echo of metal and glass and sirens and a family she had never met but had haunted her ever since. She said that when she walked into my house and saw the pictures on the mantelpiece, something inside her shattered. She realized that the man who had saved her daughter was the man whose life had been broken by a moment she had tried for years to bury beneath work, success, and silence. The cafe around us softened into background noise. People laughed at other tables, spoons clinked against cups, Christmas music whispered from a small speaker by the window, but all of it seemed far away. In that corner, time narrowed to the distance between Evelyn's eyes and my own. I saw her as more than a name on a card now. She was the living bridge between the night that had destroyed my family and the night when her child had appeared in front of my truck like a living ghost. She spoke of lawyers hired in haste, of settlements negotiated in closed rooms, of documents signed in languages of liability and protection. She explained that the case had been redirected, that responsibility had been blurred and dispersed until it faded into bureaucratic fog. On paper, my loss had become an unfortunate accident on a slippery road. In reality, it had been wrapped in power and hidden away from the light. She said she had watched from a distance, younger and weaker, paralyzed by fear of defying the people who controlled her future. She had done nothing. That nothing had grown heavier each year. When her words finally faded, we sat in silence. I felt anger, grief, confusion, and something else too complicated to name swirl together inside me. The woman across from me was partly responsible for the worst night of my life and yet also the mother of the child I had instinctively protected. I realized that my pain and her guilt were knotted together in a way that no legal document could ever untangle. I left the cafe without slamming doors or shouting accusations. I simply stood, nodded once, and stepped back into the cold. The sky had darkened again, clouds stretching across the horizon like a gray curtain. The snow had begun to fall in thin, hesitant lines, as if the world itself was unsure whether to cover or reveal what lay beneath. I walked through the streets of Winterbrook, past glowing windows and wreath-covered doors, listening to the muffled echoes of carols drifting into the night. Every step felt like moving through the shadow of that old Christmas, the one we never spoke about, the one that had followed me into this one whether I wanted it to or not. As I crossed the town square, the Christmas tree in the center shimmered with lights, and for a brief moment I thought about the people listening to this story somewhere far away, in cities and towns I would never see. I imagined them walking their own winter streets or sitting in warm rooms, and I wanted to tell them to share where they were, to leave their stories in the comments, to stay close to this channel, to subscribe so they would not walk alone through their own difficult nights. Maybe, if they stayed, this story would remind them that even buried truths eventually rise, and that facing them is the first painful step towards something like peace. I reached the edge of town without realizing how far I had walked. The road stretched ahead, familiar and merciless. Somewhere along that asphalt my life had broken once. Now I had to decide what to do with the knowledge that the person tied to that night had reappeared, carrying both the weight of her guilt and the fragile life of a little girl who had nothing to do with any of it. The snow thickened around me, and the past pressed close, refusing to stay buried any longer. The walk back home felt longer than any distance I had crossed in years, as if each step required me to drag the weight of the truth behind me through the deepening snow. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the earth, trapping Winterbrook in a gray hush that blurred the line between afternoon and night. By the time I reached my porch, my clothes were stiff with cold and my breath came out in sharp clouds that vanished before I could fully release them. Inside the house, the remnants of the previous night lingered like ghosts, the warm imprint of Lily's small body on the couch, the faint scent of chocolate still in the air, the dim glow of the Christmas lights wrapped around a tree that no longer symbolized celebration to me, only endurance. I slipped off my boots and stood for a long moment by the door, letting the silence settle around me. The truth Evelyn had laid at my feet felt like a fracture that had reopened, a wound that had never healed properly and now bled into everything I touched. I moved to the fireplace and stirred the fading embers, watching sparks rise and disappear in the air. The fire caught again slowly, its glow painting the walls with shifting shades that reminded me of shadows passing through time. Eventually, I sat at the table and rested my hands on the wood, noticing how tightly they trembled. Thoughts slid through my mind in jagged lines: the luxury car, the icy road, the moment everything changed, the voices afterwards, the weight of silence that smothered answers before they could be spoken. I had lived for years believing that the truth had been swallowed by the night. Now it stood before me with Evelyn's face and the trembling sincerity in her eyes as she confessed what she had carried. The hours passed without me noticing. Snow thickened outside, coating the windows in white frost. The clock on the wall ticked with a slow, steady rhythm that felt indifferent to the chaos inside my chest. As night settled fully over the town, a car pulled up in front of my house, its tires crunching through the frozen layer that covered the road. Headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the porch for a moment before flicking off. I remained still, waiting for the inevitable. A sharp knock broke the quiet, and this time there was nothing uncertain about it. It carried urgency, tension, and a sense of finality that made the air inside the house thicken. I opened the door and saw Evelyn standing beneath the porch light, her coat dusted with snow, her hair windblown, her eyes red as if she had been fighting tears long before she stepped out of the car. Behind her, the driver waited by the vehicle, unable to mask the stiffness in his posture. Evelyn entered quickly, bringing the cold with her. She stood near the center of the room, as if unsure where to place herself in a space that held memories not her own. She carried no rehearsed poise now. Everything about her felt stripped raw, as though the truth she had spoken earlier had peeled away the layers she had spent years building. She began to talk again, not in the polished cadence of someone used to commanding boardrooms, but in the unsteady rhythm of a person confronting the consequences of silence. She spoke of guilt that had grown heavier with time, of the fear that had shaped her decisions, of the realization that no amount of success had erased the shadows cast by that night. She explained how Lily had become her anchor, her single reminder that love could exist even in a life built from obligations and facades. She said that seeing me with Lily had broken something inside her, not because she feared losing her daughter, but because she suddenly understood the life she had helped destroy, and the man who had carried that destruction quietly for years. Her voice trembled as she said she was willing to do anything to make things right. She offered resources, legal support, financial restitution, public truth, whatever I might demand. She said the world deserved to know what had happened, and she was prepared to bear the consequences. I watched her as she spoke, not because I wanted to absorb her words, but because I needed to see the sincerity etched in the lines of her face. Her words flowed like a dam breaking, but the flood brought no comfort. It only deepened the ache. The room grew warmer with the fire crackling behind us, but the tension remained cold and sharp. I felt the rise of anger within me, not wild or loud, but deep and steady, like a frozen river cracking under its own weight. I thought of my wife's smile and my daughter's laughter, of the empty space they left behind, of the years filled with silence instead of joy. I thought of every Christmas that had passed with nothing but memories to mark the day. My gaze drifted toward the window just as a small shape appeared outside, running through the snow toward the house. The door behind Evelyn had been left slightly open, and a gust of wind pushed it wider. Lily's voice rose faintly through the cold as she entered, her small boots tapping across the floor. She looked from me to her mother, sensing the heaviness in the air. Her eyes filled with confusion, then worry, as though she feared she was the cause of the storm swirling between us. She moved closer, hesitant, drawn by the tension. Evelyn reached for her, but Lily pulled back slightly, feeling the unease settling around her like a fog. The child's presence cut through the anger inside me in a way nothing else could. Her small frame trembled, overwhelmed by emotions she did not understand. She looked at her mother with uncertainty, then at me with a kind of pleading innocence that tightened every muscle in my chest. Evelyn's voice faltered as she realized that Lily had heard enough to know something was terribly wrong. The child's face crumpled, her breathing growing unsteady, her fingers gripping the edge of her coat as if searching for stability in a world that had suddenly tilted. She whispered something broken, a confused mixture of fear and guilt, and then she turned and ran back out into the night. The front door slammed behind her, and everything inside me froze. The storm outside swallowed her instantly, her small outline vanishing into the swirling white. I heard Evelyn's breath catch as she launched toward the door with a desperate cry. My body moved before my thoughts did, pushed by instinct older than memory, older than fear. I stepped into the storm, the snow rising around my boots, the cold slicing across my face. The wind carried Lily's faint sobs away from us, scattering them across the darkness like fragile pieces of a child's heart. And in that moment, with the past pressing on my back and the present breaking open in front of me, I understood that the cost of truth had just multiplied into something neither Evelyn nor I had been prepared to face. The cold hit with a force that erased every other sensation for a few seconds, as if the world had shrunk to white air cutting through skin and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Snow swirled in frantic spirals under the porch light, then dissolved into a dense wall of darkness beyond its reach. The outline of Lily had already vanished into that moving curtain, leaving only the memory of her small boots scraping the floor and the trace of panic on her face. The night felt wider than it had any right to be, stretching out like a vast space where a child could disappear in moments. I pushed forward into it with a kind of desperate focus I had only felt once before in my life, on another winter night when everything I loved was torn out of my hands. Footprints marked the snow at first, small indentations running away from the house in uneven lines. The storm had not yet had time to erase them completely, but the wind was working fast, filling edges, blurring shapes. Evelyn stumbled behind me, her breath uneven, her steps less sure. The heels of her city shoes sank deep into the drifts, not built for this place or this kind of fear. The driver from the car shouted something indistinct toward us and then began circling around in the vehicle, headlights moving like restless eyes, cutting thin paths through the darkness. None of it felt enough. Nothing felt fast enough. The memory of another night pressed in from all sides, the memory of headlights and ice and the terrible stillness that followed. My body seemed to remember that night more clearly than my mind, guiding me with an instinct that bypassed conscious thought. The road appeared ahead, a dark slash running through the white fields, familiar and unforgiving. It curved the way it had always curved, a slow bend that lulled careless drivers into keeping their speed. I knew every inch of that stretch. I knew where the guardrail began, where the asphalt dipped slightly from years of frost and thaw, where the shattered glass had once glittered like cruel stars before it was swept away. That bend held my past like an open wound waiting to be touched. Now it held something else too, because somewhere near it, in the blur of snow and night, Lily was moving with the unsteady steps of a frightened child who believed she had broken something too important to repair. My boots dug into the drifted snow at the side of the road as I followed the faint marks of her path. Each step was a fight against the wind, which seemed determined to push me back toward the house, toward warmth, toward surrender. But there was no surrender left in me, not when I could almost feel the echo of my daughter's hand in my own, not when the present and the past had fused into a single corridor of urgency. I remembered the sickening impact of metal against metal, the shriek of twisting steel, the way the world went silent afterward, as if even the night was stunned. I remembered standing in the hospital corridor with the sterile smell burning my lungs, staring at doors that did not open. That memory surged forward like a wave. This time, there was no hospital yet, no ambulance, no wreckage. There was only snow, and the fragile outline of hope running ahead of me on uncertain feet. Evelyn caught up to me briefly, her hair loose now, her coat flung open as if she no longer cared about appearances or cold. Her face carried none of the practiced distance I had seen before. It was stripped of everything except terror. She called for her daughter in a voice that broke across the empty fields, but the wind tore the sound apart and carried it away. For a moment I saw her not as the woman tied to the old accident, not as the heir to wealth and influence, but as a mother whose world was narrowing to a single fear, that she might lose the one person for whom she had been trying, clumsily, to build something that resembled love. The realization did not erase what she had done or failed to do in the past, but it added another layer to the shape of her presence in my life. Ahead, the footprints veered closer to the road. The tracks wavered, crossing a small ditch, then rose again on the other side, leading toward the curve where the guardrail met the dark strip of pavement. The sight of that line made my stomach twist. I pushed harder, lungs burning, legs straining against the weight of the snow. The sound of an engine approached from the distance, tires hissing on ice, the low hum of a vehicle that did not yet know it was entering the most painful chapter of my life for the second time. Headlights grew larger through the snow, beams cutting across the bend in a familiar angle. I saw her then. Lily stood near the edge of the road, just before the curve, her small frame drawn in on itself, her head bowed. The wind pushed at her coat, making it billow around her like a fragile cape. She looked like a piece of the storm that had decided to stop moving. I could see the tension in her posture even from a distance, the way she hugged her arms close, the way her knees shook. It was the posture of a child who had absorbed the idea that she was the problem, that her existence caused damage, that disappearing might fix something for the adults who could not hold their own broken pieces together. The approaching car seemed to move faster with each heartbeat, its lights reflecting off the snow in a blinding wash. The curve, the child, the vehicle, the night, all aligned for one horrifying instant into a mirror of the moment that had destroyed my family. Something inside me tore open and released every ounce of strength I had left. I surged forward, throwing myself into a run that ignored age, exhaustion, and pain. The wind fought me, the snow resisted, but none of it mattered. There was no world in which I would let that scene repeat itself. Not again, not with another child, not with this one. I reached Lily just as the car began to enter the bend, the headlights sweeping across her small, motionless figure. My arms wrapped around her in a rough, instinctive embrace, and I pulled her back from the edge, stumbling with the force of my own momentum. We fell into the snow together, my body twisting so that I landed first, cushioning her from the impact. The car passed a second later, its horn erupting in a startled blast, tires skidding slightly before the driver regained control and continued on, too consumed with his own panic to realize he had crossed a ghost of someone else's nightmare. The world went quiet. Snow fell in softer patterns around us, as if the storm itself had exhaled. Lily trembled in my arms, her breath shallow, her face buried against my coat. She began to shake with sobs that came in ragged waves, the kind that speak of fear mixed with something heavier, something like shame. Her small hands clung to the fabric, desperate for an anchor. She poured out broken phrases between gasps, saying she did not want to cause trouble, that she did not want to see more arguments, that if she disappeared maybe everything would hurt less for everyone else. The words struck me with a force more brutal than any collision. They carried the echo of my own guilt, the years I had spent believing that if I had done something differently, driven slower, paid more attention, fought harder, the outcome might have changed. As I held her in that frozen field, near the road where my past had shattered, I understood that losing a child was not a single moment. It was an absence that repeated itself in echoes, in new lives, in new mistakes, in new winters. I realized that if I let my anger guide me, if I allowed this girl to believe she was a piece of collateral damage in an old war between adults, then I would be losing a child for the second time, not in death, but in spirit. The knowledge settled over me with a clarity that cut through grief and rage alike. I could not undo the old accident. I could not bring my wife and daughter back. But I could choose what happened next, right here, on this road, with this child who was shaking in my arms and waiting to see whether the world would break her too. Evelyn reached us moments later, stumbling through the snow, her breath ragged, her face streaked with tears that had frozen at the edges. She collapsed beside us, hands reaching toward her daughter, eyes wide with horror at how close she had come to repeating the kind of loss she had helped create in my life. Her body folded around Lily, creating a cocoon of warmth and desperation. I watched her shoulders shudder as she tried to steady herself, as she tried to hold her child and her guilt at the same time. We knelt there together in the snow, the three of us bound by a moment that had pulled together years of pain and fear into a fragile, shared space. The road that had once been the border between my old life and everything that came after now held something else, the possibility of a different ending, not free of sorrow, but layered with choice. The headlights of the passing car had long faded, the night had closed around us again, but I sensed that the path ahead would no longer be a solitary one haunted only by ghosts. The storm began to ease. The wind softened, the snow fell in gentler flurries, and the sky above us seemed to lighten by the slightest degree. I looked at the curve of the road, then at the fields, then at the two figures pressed close beside me. I understood that the story could not end here, on the edge of the place where I had lost everything once before. If anything was to change, if any form of healing was ever going to grow from this frozen ground, there was only one place left to go on this Christmas Eve. The night was not finished with us yet. Somewhere in the quiet beyond the fields, under snow-covered stones, my past waited to be faced. The road back to town felt different with Lily walking between us, one hand inside mine and the other inside Evelyn's, as if she were the fragile bridge holding together two worlds that had been tearing each other apart for years without even knowing it. Snow crunched beneath our boots in a steady rhythm, marking each step through the quiet fields. The storm had softened into a light drizzle of flakes drifting from the sky like small pieces of ash, gentle and almost peaceful. The air still bit with winter's sharpness, but there was a strange softness woven into it now, as if the night itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The lights of Winterbrook shimmered in the distance, warm and distant, a cluster of gold in a sea of white and gray. Somewhere behind those windows families were gathered around tables and trees, trading stories, laughing, arguing, reconciling over small things that would be forgotten by morning. For years I had watched those lights from afar, an observer to a celebration that no longer felt meant for me. Tonight, though, I was not just watching. I was moving through the darkness with two people who had pulled me back into the tangled weave of human connection, whether I had wanted it or not. We reached the outskirts of town without speaking, each of us carrying a storm of thoughts that did not need to be voiced. The path to the cemetery branched away from the main road, a narrow lane half covered in snow, lined by bare trees reaching skinny branches toward the sky like unanswered questions. I had walked this lane more times than I could count, sometimes with flowers in my hands, sometimes with nothing but the hollow weight inside my chest. Tonight I carried no flowers. I carried truth, pain, and a decision that still felt too large for my tired heart. As we entered the cemetery, the world grew quieter, as if even the wind respected the sleep of the names carved into the stones. The snow softened the outlines of the graves, turning them into rounded shapes that rose gently from the ground like memories half remembered. A thin layer of frost coated the iron gate, and the path beyond it had only faint traces of footprints from earlier in the day. Christmas Eve visits had already been made by those who still came in groups, leaving wreaths and candles. I had always come alone. The familiar markers guided my steps almost without effort. I knew exactly where to turn, exactly how many paces lay between the gate and the place where my life had split in two. The headstones appeared ahead, side by side, modest in shape but immense in meaning. My wife's name rested on one, my daughter's on the other, each letter etched into stone with the finality that had once felt unbearable. Over the years, the edges had collected tiny cracks from frost and time, but the names remained clear, unbroken, waiting for every visit like eyes that never closed. I stopped in front of them and felt the air catch in my lungs. It always happened this way, no matter how many times I came. Time blurred for a moment, and I saw not stones but faces and movements and laughter. I saw my daughter spinning in the yard with a scarf trailing behind her, my wife leaning in the doorway with her arms crossed and her eyes full of warmth. I felt again the weight of the day we laid them here, the cold that seemed to seep into my bones and never fully leave. For a long moment I stood in silence, letting those images pass through me like a slow reel of film, each frame heavier than the last. Lily stayed close, her hands still wrapped inside mine, small and warm and trembling a little. She looked at the stones with careful attention, as if trying to understand how the names and dates could contain so much of my story. Evelyn stood a few steps back, not hiding, but not intruding either, as if unsure whether she had the right to stand as close to my grief as her actions had placed her. Her breath came in slow, unsteady waves, visible in the cold air. Her eyes did not leave the headstones. It was as if she had come to face not only what she had done, but the people she had once allowed to become invisible behind her comfort and fear. The tension of the night seemed to gather into a single, dense point in my chest. My mind replayed the confession in the cafe, the offer of money and resources, the explanations about family pressure and youthful cowardice. None of those things had changed the fact that my wife and daughter were gone. Nothing ever would. Yet standing there, with Lily pressed against my side and Evelyn facing the weight of what lay written in stone, I felt something else enter the scene. It started as a faint warmth, a quiet awareness that my heart, though scarred, still beat with the stubborn insistence of someone who had not yet given up entirely on being more than a victim of one night. Memories from other Christmases surfaced, older than the tragedy, older than grief. I remembered my daughter helping me hang ornaments, my wife laughing when lights tangled, the way we used to talk about forgiveness as if it were a simple, obvious thing. Forgiveness had died with them, or at least that was what I had believed. I had spent years feeding anger in secret, telling myself it was a form of loyalty, a way of staying close to what I had lost. But in truth, anger had only built a small room inside of me and locked me there. It had kept me from noticing how many winters had passed without me living any of them. The thought rose slowly, not fully formed, but insistent. Holding on to rage would not bring justice. It would only show Lily that pain must be answered with more pain. It would teach her that the mistakes of her mother were hers to pay for, that the ghosts of one Christmas could haunt every Christmas that followed. I saw the way she had stood by the road, convinced that her disappearance might make things easier for everyone else, and I broke a little more inside. No child should carry that belief. No child should become a vessel for debts that belong to adults. The decision did not arrive as a bright, shining revelation. It came like a slow, difficult breath after being held underwater for too long. I realized that forgiveness was not a feeling waiting to appear, but a choice made in spite of pain. It was not a way of erasing what happened, but a way of refusing to let the past keep writing the rest of the story. Forgiving Evelyn would not change the night of the accident. It would, however, change the night we were living now, this Christmas Eve where our lives had collided again in a way none of us could have predicted. I let that truth settle through my body, from my chest to my hands to my knees that suddenly felt weaker. I imagined my wife's gaze if she could see me there, imagined my daughter's small hand resting in my own again. I had spent so long wondering what they would want from me, and now, for the first time, the answer felt simple. They would not want my life to end on the same road where theirs had. They would not want me to turn away from a child in need because of the blood that ran in her veins. They would not want me to feed in anger that only made their memory harder to carry. A quiet calm began to spread through me, not warm exactly, but steady. I turned slightly, enough to include Evelyn and Lily in the space between myself and the stones. The past stood behind me, written, unchangeable. The present stood beside me, fragile and uncertain. The future, for the first time in years, felt like something not completely predetermined by pain. I understood, in that small circle of snow and stone and breath, that I could choose to let go of the right to revenge, even if the ache never fully left. I could choose to extend a hand instead of a sentence. In that act, something like a miracle stirred. Not the kind sung about in carols, not the kind wrapped in ribbons and bows, but a smaller, quieter miracle, a man deciding that grief would not be the final word, a woman facing the full shape of her fault without running, a child learning that the worst things adults do to each other do not have to define her worth. The miracle was not that everything was suddenly healed. It was that healing had finally been allowed to begin. The wind eased. A soft stillness settled over the cemetery, as if the night itself nodded in quiet acknowledgement. I stayed a while longer by the graves, then stepped back, feeling less like I was leaving them behind and more like I was carrying them with me into something new. Lily reached for my hand again, and I let her fingers wrap around mine. Evelyn stood close, shoulders lowered, eyes glistening with a mixture of sorrow and an unfamiliar, hesitant hope. We walked away from the graves together. Behind us lay the story of what had been taken. Ahead of us, perhaps for the first time, lay the possibility of what could still be built. On that Christmas Eve, I did not forget what I had lost. I never will. But for the first time since the night of the accident, I chose to believe that loss did not have to be the only thing that defined me. The walk back from the cemetery carried a kind of quiet I had never known before. It wasn't the silence of grief or the numbness that follows shock. It was something gentler, something that moved through the cold air like a soft ribbon, winding itself around the three of us as if guiding us through the dark. The snow had settled into a slow drift, heavier than mist and lighter than fog, falling in delicate flakes that clung to eyelashes and coats before melting into nothing. Winterbrook glowed ahead with its small town lights, flickering through the branches of the pines as though trying to call us back from the edge of everything we had faced. Lily kept her hand in mine, her steps soft but steady, no longer darting or trembling. Every few moments she pressed closer, as if making sure that I remained beside her and that the night would not swallow her again. Evelyn walked on her other side with a posture stripped of all the polish she usually carried. She moved like someone learning how to breathe in a new world, unsure of the rhythm but committed to finding it. The cold brushed her face, but she did not shield herself from it. She let the night touch her, as if she believed she deserved the sting. We took the long way back into town, passing the frozen lake that shimmered beneath a thin sheen of moonlight pushing through the clouds. A few lanterns hung from posts along the path, their glow swaying with the wind, casting soft halos onto the snow. Every shadow that stretched across the path seemed less threatening now, less tied to memory and more to the gentle motion of the world moving forward. It occurred to me, as we passed the quiet houses with wreaths on the doors, that I no longer felt like the man who had walked alone into the storm earlier that night. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a steady, undeniable way. When we reached my house again, the porch light flickered in its usual stubborn rhythm, a small, defiant reminder that even things built long ago could continue doing their job if given a chance. The Christmas tree inside cast a warm glow across the living room window, turning the glass into a soft mirror reflecting our silhouettes. I opened the door and let the warmth of the fire greet us once more. The house felt different now. It felt lived in, as if the night's events had breathed something new into the walls. Lily walked to the couch and sat down slowly, still wrapped in the blanket she had used earlier. Her eyes followed the dance of the flames in the fireplace, and for the first time since I had found her on the road, her face carried a calm that didn't seem borrowed or fragile. Something had eased inside her. She curled her legs beneath her and rested her head on the arm of the couch, watching the fire with an expression that bordered on wonder. She looked like a child who had stepped out of a storm and found the place she hadn't known she needed. Evelyn stood near the doorway for a moment, taking in the room as though committing every detail to memory. Then she moved closer to the fire, but not too close, as if respecting the warmth that had already settled between Lily and me. There was still distance between us, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt more like the space needed for healing to stretch and settle. She breathed out a long, quiet sigh that seemed to release years of tension, and her shoulders lowered in a way that spoke of surrender rather than defeat. Time passed slowly inside the house, marked only by the shift of the flames and the occasional crackle of wood. I sat in my old armchair, letting exhaustion seep through my limbs in a gentle way, not as a collapse but as a release. The storm outside continued to thin, and through the window I could see the pines moving in a soft rhythm, as though acknowledging the transformation that had taken place between their shadows. As the minutes deepened into hours, thoughts drifted through my mind like the quiet flakes still falling outside. I remembered every Christmas since the accident, each one marked by a sense of distance and dislocation, as though I had been walking through the holidays as a ghost. I remembered pretending to work late so I wouldn't have to witness the celebrations happening around town. I remembered turning off the radio when familiar carols played, unable to bear the sound of joy I no longer recognized. Each memory felt like a layer I had worn for so long that I forgot the weight of it. Tonight, for the first time in years, that weight had begun to lift. I looked at Lily and realized that the path forward would not be easy. Healing was not a straight road, it was a winding one, filled with memories that would rise at unexpected moments. Yet she had shown me something I had forgotten, that even in the aftermath of fear, a child could find comfort in the simplest things, a fire, a blanket, the presence of someone who cared. She had carried her own burdens, believing she caused harm simply by existing, and something inside me shifted painfully at that realization. Children should never carry such shadows. Adults create those shadows. Adults also have the power to dissolve them. Evelyn moved closer to her daughter, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled. The sight of her kneeling near the couch, watching Lily with a tender, tentative expression, revealed a different kind of woman than the one who had appeared at my door earlier. She was stripped of wealth, status, and facade in that moment. She was simply a mother trying to learn how to love in a way that would not wound. Her face softened each time Lily moved, as if the child's small gestures rewrote the lines of guilt etched into her features. The fire burned lower, and the corners of the house deepened into reddish shadows. I leaned back, letting the warmth seep into my hands. As I watched the room, I found myself thinking about the thousands of people who might one day hear this story in places far from Winterbrook. I imagined them listening in apartments, in houses, in cars parked outside grocery stores, in living rooms where families gathered, and in bedrooms where loneliness pressed close. I imagined people scattered across continents, dealing with their own scars, their own unfinished winters. I hoped they would tell me where they were watching from, not out of curiosity, but out of a desire to see how far one story could travel and how many hearts it might reach. I hoped they would subscribe in return, not for numbers or recognition, but because I wanted them to walk with me through stories that spoke of forgiveness and the quiet strength that hides behind brokenness. Midnight approached, and the town bells in the distance began to toll faintly through the cold air. The sound drifted in through the walls, soft and solemn. It mingled with the crackling fire and the slow breaths of the child sleeping on the couch. Christmas Day had arrived. For years that moment had come like a blow, a reminder of everything I had lost. This time, though, it arrived differently. It felt like a gentle hand placed over mine, inviting me to stand, not in celebration, but in acceptance. In that small living room, with snow still falling outside and warmth flickering from the hearth, I understood what Christmas finally meant to me. It was not a date meant to heal all wounds, nor a promise that everything broken would be restored. It was a night that asked a single, quiet question: whether a heart that had been shattered could still choose to open. Whether grief could soften into kindness. Whether forgiveness could grow in a place where pain once lived without competition. I looked at the two people who had stepped into my life through tragedy and confession and fear. One carried the memory of what was taken from me. The other carried the possibility of what could still be given. In their presence, I felt something settle inside me, not closure, but a beginning. Christmas, I realized, was not about forgetting the past. It was about refusing to let the past close all the doors to the future. On that night, after years of silence and sorrow, I finally chose to believe in the fragile, difficult miracle of moving on. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something warm and steady in my chest, something I had not dared to feel in years.